So these videos are turning into something of a little series on the channel, huh? I'm cool with that, and it looks like you guys are too. The next Zelda is an exciting thought, the next 3D open world adventure to follow up on Breath of the Wild. We know it's going to continue the open air theme, and we know it'll launch on the Switch, but aside from that and a couple more little nuggets of detail, we don't know anything about the game. I've made a video before on what I want to see in the next Zelda game, check that out if you haven't already, but today I thought it'd be fun to try and make some predictions for the next game in the series. Although we know next to nothing about it, what predictions do I have? What sort of game do I think it'll be, judging on the very little information we know about it? Let's run through a few predictions. Joy-Con motion controls. Alright, first up, something that might actually upset a fair few people if it was included, motion controls. I genuinely think there's a decent chance that we'll see the return of some kind of motion controls in Zelda. No, not a whole game built around them like Skyward Sword, but not just a couple of novel motion control sections like some shrine puzzles in Breath of the Wild either. The Switch's Joy-Con motion controls are something Nintendo are pushing for in a huge amount of their games. Mario Odyssey, for example, has a load of techniques you can pull off only by flicking the Joy-Cons in certain ways. Or Mario Party having a ton of motion control minigames like searing meat in a frying pan. The reason I think we'll see motion controls make their return to the Zelda series with the next game, and the reason I think we didn't see a huge use of them in Breath of the Wild, is that that game was, first and foremost, a Wii U game ported to the Switch. Whatever way you look at it, Breath of the Wild was built solely for the Wii U at the beginning. The Zelda team love to integrate the system's gimmicks into their games, such as using the DS's touchscreen for Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, and the two Wii Zeldas using the system's motion controls for combat. I think it's likely too that the Sheikah Slate was originally an in-game representation of the Wii U gamepad, used for things like the map and the camera, before this idea was scrapped and it was made to work on the Switch. So what's the Nintendo Switch's big feature? Well, aside from having the whole Play Anywhere thing, it's definitely the Joy-Cons. They're actually incredible little controllers when you think about it, with gyros, accelerometers, HD rumble and more, features which Breath of the Wild made use of nearly none of. It was a game designed to use what the Wii U could offer, such as their limited motion control puzzles. But the next big Zelda is being developed for the Switch and only the Switch, meaning I think we'll almost definitely see it make use of more of what the system has to offer, motion controls included. Perhaps motion control swordplay will return, though I'm sure most players would appreciate an option to toggle between it and normal controller combat. Abandoning the timeline. Alright, another controversial one. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the Zelda timeline. I absolutely love little things like seeing the Arbiter's Grounds ruins in the desert in Breath of the Wild and wondering, am I standing over the buried remains of the ancient dungeon from Twilight Princess? I don't really mean I think they'll fully abandon the timeline, it's too established at this point. I think we'll see another Breath of the Wild style approach, where they essentially just retcon the entire timeline as shrouded in the fog of legend, then slap the game at the end of all three branches. Because fuck it, who cares for continuity? In an interview in the Creating a Champion book, Aonuma reveals that he's really happy with just leaving the timeline up to the players' imaginations, letting them figure things out and come up with their own ideas. So I think it's a pretty decent bet that for the next game, it won't be 100 years after Breath of the Wild sequel type deal, it'll be a lot more ambiguous. Open air exploration. Okay, this one's pretty much confirmed for the new game, that's obvious. In multiple interviews, Aonuma has mentioned that he wants the open air concept of Breath of the Wild to continue into the new games, calling it the new standard of the series. For a while I was unclear just what they meant by open air. Why not just call it open world? Bill Trinan mentioned that a lot of the time for open world games, the world itself is just a setting in which the story unfolds. But with Zelda, the world itself is completely integrated into the exploration, adventure and gameplay, and that it's such a big part of the game, not just the setting. Aonuma has mentioned too in interviews that with Ocarina of Time, the first 3D Zelda, they designed the world with different set routes, i.e. a path from Kakariko up to Death Mountain you can follow just so you don't get lost. But with Breath of the Wild, he likes that you can travel from point A to point B absolutely however you want. You don't have to follow a set route that the game designers have left for you. So I think whatever the setting for the next Zelda, whether we're back in the skies, on the seas, or something completely new, we'll be able to travel completely freely anywhere we want. Traditional dungeons. Traditional dungeons are something I've always said Breath of the Wild was lacking. Badly. They're part of why I love Zelda so much. The fire temples, forest temples, water temples, maybe a sky or shadow temple, a temple where you're insect size, a temple that inverts itself, or a temple to settle any and all items matches. Wrong temple. Whatever the theme, Zelda dungeons are awesome, and so are shrines, but they got so stale so quickly because they're all the same theme. I've mentioned this before in my What the Next Zelda Game Needs video, so I'll spare you any more talk on why I think the game should include them. But what I want aside, I think there's a good chance we will see a return to a variety of themed temples in the next game. Part of the reasoning for this is simply because Nintendo listened to what people did and didn't like overall with Zelda games, which is why Breath of the Wild is a direct response to the criticisms of Skyward Sword's linearity. Another strong bit of evidence for the return of dungeons comes in the form of a couple of job listings recently posted by Nintendo Japan, one for a 3D CG designer and one for a level designer. The former would apparently be responsible for designing terrain for fields and dungeons, and the latter would be responsible for planning game events, dungeons, enemies and fields. So while vague, we know Nintendo are hiring people to work on dungeons in some form for the next game. And while there's a chance these are just shrines or shrine-like mini-dungeons, I think it's really unlikely. I'm pretty confident we'll see a return to classic Zelda dungeons in the next game, albeit dotted around a completely freely explorable open overworld. Stroke dogs. Yep, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be able to pet dogs in the next Zelda game. Instant Game of the Year. I'm only half joking too. Hidemaru Fujibayashi mentioned that he found out in Breath of the Wild people wanted to pet the dogs found at stables, but couldn't, and the conversations like this gave him motivation for the new game. He knows! The man knows! And finally we can relive our Nintendogs days, this time in Hyrule. E3 2019. Oh boy, this one's a bold prediction. I genuinely believe there's a decent chance we'll see something for the next Zelda game at E3 2019, even if it's just the tiniest teaser trailer. I don't really know why I think this, maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I'd be genuinely surprised if we didn't get some kind of Zelda announcement next E3, and I'd be willing to bet it'd be the next 3D open world game. Okay, maybe I wouldn't bet that much on it, like a blue rupee, I'd bet that. Fingers crossed for next E3. It's not going to be what we expect. Up until now, whenever I've talked about the next Zelda game on the Switch, I've pretty much had an image in my head of Breath of the Wild, but with a better story and more features, just because that's the easiest way to do it. It's a solid foundation for the future of the series, why wouldn't they build on it? But I think there's a strong possibility that we don't get anything close to what we had with Breath of the Wild. Sure, I think we'll still get open world exploration, but it's sort of Aonuma's thing to take our expectations and completely blow them away. People want a dark, gritty Zelda on the GameCube? Give them Wind Waker, the cartoony, bright adventure on the seas. People want something similar to Ocarina of Time again? Give them Skyward Sword, a game set before Hyrule was even founded. In an interview in Nikkei Trendy, shortly after the release of Breath of the Wild, Aonuma mentioned that because of how established and beloved the Zelda series is, it's really hard to reform it like with Breath of the Wild, but that when they do, this change surprises and pleases the players. He then noted that when seeing how well Breath of the Wild was received due to how different it was, it made him realise the significance of the series, and that he wants to continue to surprise us in the future. So I think in some regards it's almost pointless trying to predict what the next Zelda game will be like. There are things we can predict, but for a lot of it, Aonuma seems keen to subvert our expectations yet again. I think it's pretty unlikely we'll see a Breath of the Wild 2 set in the same Hyrule with a Sheikah theme. I don't know what we'll get, but I know it'll be amazing. So what predictions do you guys have for the next Zelda game? Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you want to see some more Zelda content. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.